Dear colleagues and dear friends, first of all, I want to welcome everyone to the Maison Française. We are delighted to host this event here today for many reasons. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Pascal Marty. I'm the director of the Maison Française. And again, it's a really great pleasure to have all of you here today for this very, very special event. First of all, for us, I think it's very important to celebrate this special year, the 120 years of anniversary of the Entente Cordiale. So we will have at the Maison a series of events, but this one is very particular and very dear to us for many reasons. Like I said, first, well, it is under the patronage of the French presidency, and we know it's a great honor. Then we are very delighted to have this collaboration with the Institut Georges Pompidou, and I want to thank all the members, and particularly Olivier Simre, who is here, the director, and all his team, for the support and the close work we did together for the organization of the event. Then Entente Cordiale is also very important because it's for us an occasion of showing the excellent collaboration with our friends of the French Embassy, and I'm very glad to have here three eminent members of the team. Guillaume Lacroix will come and speak just after me, but I want to thank also the members and the team of Consular Mina Femme from the Scientific and Higher Education Service at the embassy. So thank you for your support and for being here. And then, well, scientifically, I think, well, I want to say that the Maison Française is an academic research center with an intense activity in history and political science. So for us, having this celebration of the 50th anniversary of the death of President Pompidou is also a way of showing how research in history takes a great part and a very important part in what is, I think, something we must not forget, and that something we must give eminent importance is what I would call the political memory. And so I think it's excellent today to have this event about the archive, about sources, about the method, about the historical research, and of course having this focus on the relations between the UK and France through the figures of Heath and Pompidou was a brilliant idea that Olivier supported since the very beginning. So that will be all for me. A few remarks, housekeeping remarks to end. So the fire exits are there on my left and here through this door on the right. So the facilities and toilets are in the corridor, and it's a privilege for the speakers and the chairs to have glasses of water at the table, but unfortunately we will ask you not to bring cups of tea and coffee on the auditorium, please. So again, thank you very much, a warm welcome, and I'm glad to give the floor to Guillaume Lacroix from the French Embassy.
Bonjour, good morning. Thank you very much, Pascal. A quick word on behalf of the Ambassador Hélène Duchesne. Thank you for inviting the embassy. I'm here with two colleagues, as Pascal just said. Thank you to the organizers, the Institut Georges Pompidou. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to the participants. And thank you to our host. It's a privilege to be here, and I will try my best to stay here until the very end of the colloque. It's a great sunny day in Oxford, and it's a great opportunity to reflect on the history between our two countries, our two heads of states, our two heads of governments. Times have changed since the 70s. I think they will be part of the discussion, but it is also an opportunity to reflect on where we are now. And as Pascal just mentioned, This is the 20th anniversary of the Entente Cordiale, and there is no doubt that there will be many more anniversaries to celebrate and to commemorate between our two people, our two countries. Times have changed, but there are strong elements of continuity. The first being probably geography. It's not going to change, and that imposes duties on us as far as security is concerned, as far as the control of our borders are concerned, but also as far as our trade and investment opportunities are concerned. We are two countries that have a lot in common. We are two key actors and players in the security of Europe. This was reaffirmed not too long ago at the level of the President Macron and Prime Minister Sunak, when they met on the occasion of the bilateral summit that was held in March of last year in the context of the war in Ukraine, in the context of rising challenges. And in a few months, President Sunak will host the European Political Community Summit, not far from here actually, at Blenheim Palace. And President Macron is not only keen to come, but I think very committed, as Prime Minister Sunak is, in the development of this community, the big European family that shares democratic values and that shares an engagement in not asserting ourselves, but in taking more responsibilities in the security of Europe, but also in protecting our people, in protecting our values. So I'm very, very pleased to see that this colloque today is part of the 120th anniversary of the Entente Cordiale commemoration. We will do our best to publicize, to promote your discussions today. It is a small contribution, but for us it's really, really, really important. As you know, this colloque is under the patronage of le Président de la République. Just to end on a personal note, I was born in 1971. I don't have clear memories of President Pompidou, but I have some memories of the black and white TV set in my living room. And I belong to a generation to whom Montboudif, Cajard, Orvilliers are familiar names. Also, not a memory, but I happen to have been posted in Chicago before coming here to London. And Chicago is the city where President Pompidou delivered an amazing speech, a visionary speech about environment, about la ville, l'automobile, les responsabilités de l'homme et de la femme devant la nature, absolument incroyable. Et ce discours, qui est dans la liste de votre bibliographie, je suis sûr que vous le connaissez, but I think it should be read in all schools, not just in France, but also in United Kingdom, because it says a lot about the values that we have in common. Voilà, je vous remercie, je vous souhaite un très très bon colloque. Merci beaucoup de l'invitation.
Mr. First Chancellor, thank you for your speech, and it's this very important speech of Georges Pompidou in Chicago about environment. So, Madam Chancellor of Scientific and Academic Cooperation, Mr. Director Pascal Marty, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps Oxford students joining us during examination period. On behalf of the President of the Institut Georges Pompidou, Bernard Ezambert, and the President of the Scientific Advisory Board, Christine Manigan, I would like to thank Pascal Marty, the Director of the MFO, and François-Joseph Roudiou for hosting us in this handsome place. I would also like to thank the Scientific Advisory Board of the Institut Georges Pompidou, without which none of this would have been possible. I extend my thanks to Mr. Dominique Grieve, who gave us the honor of accepting to preside with great enthusiasm over today's first session, and whose commitments and high positions allow him to bring a valuable perspective to this conference. I would also like to thank Professor Emeritus Anne Dayton of Oxford University, who actively supported the organization of this conference and who will preside over the second session after discussing this morning. I would like to extend my gratitude to our British academic and archival colleagues, along with those residing in the UK, who accepted to take part today. Professor Emeritus Anne Dayton, of course, Professor Piers Ludlow from the LSE, Professor Beatrice Heuser from the University of Glasgow, Lecturer Daniel Furby from EPLO in Athens, Cesare Vagge from Oxford University, and Suzanne Thomas and Jeremy McIlwain of the Bodleian Libraries. My warm thanks also goes to the French colleagues who accepted to travel to Oxford. Professor Emeritus Marie-Claude Esposito from l'Université Paris 3 Sorbonne Nouvelle, Lecturer Agnès Tachin from l'Université de Cergy-Pontoise, Lecturer Stéphane Porion from l'Université de Tours, Boris Hamzeyan, Research Fellow at the Centre National d'Art Contemporain Georges Pompidou, and Bénédicte Fichet, who is representing the Archives Nationales and whose loyal collaboration has made invaluable contributions to the work of the Institut Georges Pompidou. In 2 words, why all today's gathering? Firstly, because we are commemorating the 50th anniversary of President Georges Pompidou's passing, and perhaps also the 120th anniversary of the Entente Cordiale. How to forget the Pompidou-Heath moment, 2 politicians who had such a substantial impact on French-British relations. On 4 March 1974, Edward Heath resigned, and on 2 April, as the Ministers of Foreign Affairs meeting in Luxembourg listened as James Callaghan asked to renegotiate the Treaty of Accession that had taken effect just 1 year and 4 months earlier, Georges Pompidou died of Waldenström disease. Sir Michael Palliser, who was negotiated on 2 April in Luxembourg, spoke at the conference held on 25 and 26 November 1993 regarding his emotion upon learning of President Pompidou's death and of crucial role played by these 2 remarkable and different men. In the context of these commemorations, should the UK's accession to the EEC, which was prevented on multiple occasions by a French veto, be more broadly revisited? The interest of exploring this turning point from the 70s becomes obvious when assessing the importance of archives that remain insufficiently used, especially the public and private Pompidou's archives at the Archives Nationales and the Institut Georges Pompidou, in addition to Edward Heath at the Bodleian, whose inventorying has not yet been completed. On both sides of the channel, the archives of the 2 leaders appear to be less frequently consulted by researchers, even as the post-Brexit context invites us to understand the path traveled from those years to the recent upheavals in Europe and the world. So, I will briefly summarize. The purpose of this conference is therefore to reflect on new avenues from French-British research and collaboration, starting with an overview of available archives, a brief historiographic assessment, and the identification of scientific issues setting out from the Pompidou-Heath moment. The goal is also to dispel certain biases by going against the flow of current intellectual trends. if there were only one French-British duo, it would probably be Georges Pompidou and Edward Heath, both of whom were from modest backgrounds. Their respective intentions and the accession negotiation deserve further exploration, with a view to providing greater perspective for 15 years of British experience in the single market, as well as for French-British relations in the face of European challenges. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to chair this first session of this colloque, which I've been invited to do by the Institute and Georges Pompidou. The position is that we're going to ask our speakers to address the meeting, the colloque, for about 20 minutes each. I'm told I've got to be a martinet in keeping people to time, so 20 minutes it's got to be. And then when we've had those 3 20-minute sessions, we will then have an open discussion and conversation on what's been said. I think, and we've discussed this before the start, I suspect bilingualism is pretty current throughout this assembly, and therefore what we're going to do is, although the papers will be read in English, when it comes to the conversation, and in deference to Agnes, who thinks that doing that in English is going to be difficult for her, we will probably do it in French, although if people want to speak in English, they're most welcome to do so, and we can do some simultaneous translation, which will add to the general buzz in the background. Without any more ado, I am going to ask Anne Dayton to address us. She's the Emeritus Professor of European International Politics in the Department of Politics and International Relations of the University of Oxford, and a member of the History faculty and a lot of other things besides. But you can read all the biography by looking in your brochure. Anne.
Thank you very much indeed. Am I audible at the back of the room? Thank you very much. Distinguished visitors, academics, colleagues, researchers, diplomats, and friends. It's very nice to meet you here today. And many thanks to the organisers. It's always strange to me that organising a conference between two countries so close to each other can be so complicated. Just imagine if we'd been doing Britain and South Africa. It would have been even worse, I suspect, or perhaps much easier. I will talk for only up to 20 minutes, and I will not use PowerPoint. My title was Into the European Community at Last, Reinventing Britain as a European Power, point d'interrogation. I must begin by saying, of course, geographically, geopolitically, we were European before we joined the European community. We remain European since. So what we're looking at is the change in our mentalité, if you like, the way in which we deal with our continental partners. And so the Heath-Pompidou duo marked a sharp change for Britain's self-perception of itself. We'd been spending many centuries before balancing power in Europe, fighting on the continent, and working out who were our best friends and those whom we could not trust. And of course, the borders of Europe, which until the Cold War seemed more naturally to include Russia, have been problematic all the way. So, have we seen a 50-year adventure of our membership of the community? Is it a swerve from the path of British history? Or is our leaving the community an unfortunate hiatus in the European history of the United Kingdom? Secondly, sources, no better place to start than sources. And we've been extremely lucky yesterday to have a sight of some of the Heath papers, to which I will return in a moment. Contemporary historians have big problems. When we use verbal resources, or oral interviews, as well as archives, we have to be very careful that politicians will tell us the truth. Every politician likes to colour the past in their own light, and the output of memoirs by British politicians is only testimonial to that tendency to rewrite history after the day. So the sources are extremely important, and we're very grateful to both the French and the British archivists for their contribution to this. It's very, very important. And last, I think that this shows that we must visit and revisit the role of individuals. From individual files and dossiers that we now have on Pompidou and Heath, we can see new insights into this aspect of our past, whereas historians must also think about the role of senior civil servants, diplomats, and others who are party politicians, of course, who are supporting one position or another. And increasingly, the role of civil society in forming a mentalité, a view of the world, and a desire to cooperate or to pull back from international transactions. And I think that the complexity of that was very great after the Second World War, and it remains very great today. First of all, I would like very briefly to remind you of some of the context leading up to our membership in '73. For many of us, this is familiar territory, but it doesn't hurt to revisit briefly. So back in '45, Britain had not been invaded and not been defeated. Our continental partners were very busy, engaged in rebuilding their own national societies, and in the case of Germany to the east and beyond, reforming their own national visions of the world and indeed of their own countries. We were at the top table. We were the country that wanted to build its own nuclear force. We could balance power still by our role in Western Germany, which did not exist till 1949. So early British strategic leadership is based on a global view of the world, heavily marked by the contribution that the Empire Commonwealth had made to the war. We desired political cooperation, new institutions, the sustenance of our Empire Commonwealth role, and the quest, as we hoped, for an equally possible relationship with the US. Although within the Foreign Office, we tended to talk about the big 2.5, not the big 3. That is, the United States of America, the Soviet Union, and Britain being the half, of course. So even as the United Nations and new institutions came to dominate, we were driven by growing bipolarity with the Cold War. And as early as 1949, the Americans began to worry about the British preoccupation with its imperial Commonwealth links. And the British began to speak out against movement against supranationality and in favour of cooperation very much on a Commonwealth model. Yet even at the same time, we were losing our own empire. This takes me to 1950, very briefly, which I argue is perhaps the most important turning point in an understanding of our background, when the Franco-West German Schuman Plan was proposed. This was an idea to put the combined efforts of the coal and steel communities under joint leadership. To hug each other so closely, war would not be possible once again. This was the moment in which Edwin Dell asserts that Britain lost the leadership in Europe, and I think he may be right. We turned it down, and I must pay a special tribute to Jeremy, our archivist, for showing us yesterday the first handwritten draft of Edward Heath in his maiden speech in the House of Commons in 1950. And in the handwritten draft, but not in the House of Commons speech, because I checked it last night, he actually noted down, Britain and the Empire must join the Schuman Plan, which is a really very interesting addition to our knowledge of that period. It was ironed out before he got to make his speech. Now, this took place under a Labour government, and the Conservatives were happy to make party political points in the version towards the Labour Party. But Edward Heath then stood out as someone who said this was a proposal that had to be accepted in its totality. And this marked him out from a very early date as a different kind of conservative from many of his peers. So there's a very good example of something that has changed the view that we may have of Heath from an early stage. As we know, the period of the late 40s and 50s is marked by bickering, disagreements, but progress, both on the line of supranational integration and on the line of cooperative integration. I hesitate to use the word again, where the British became increasingly suspicious of not having the freedom to do just what they wanted. And this was based on a view that Britain could, I hesitate to use the phrase because it's been used, unfortunately, subsequently, to have our cake and eat it. We wanted to keep our ties with the Commonwealth and the old empire, even as we went through a process of decolonisation. We wanted our special relationship, although America had a special relationship with both France and West Germany. And we wanted to be a European power, to have our feet in all camps. And so we turned down the Schuman Plan offer in 50 and went for a process of trying to think about association rather than membership. But when we get to the 70s, the pressures from the United States, from decolonisation, and from our relative economic decline continued to push us towards the European community. I won't discuss the details because we have real specialists to do that later today. By the time Heath came to power, the third, or the second and a half application is on the table, and it's very interesting to note that this application, like the others, is led by a Prime Minister. It is managed through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, but led by the Prime Minister. It had been Macmillan who had spoken out, 61, it had been Wilson in 67, and now it is Heath. But when we look at the documents, the British have been slow to change their own worldview. Much of the correspondence and the memos and the briefings are quite antagonistic towards the French in particular, quite transactional in approach, emphasis on economics, trade, and there's a very interesting document in the Prime Minister's files in the National Archives which points out the 10 arguments for going in. But being more European is not one of them. Working with France in a community would strengthen our role in NATO with the United States for an Atlantic community. And the rest of the arguments are very much on economics, trade, and a wider market. So the thinking is still balance of power thinking. And that leads us to reflect on why the French changed their mind in 70 and why the Germans came out more strongly under Willy Brandt in favour of Britain's membership, whereas in 63 and 67, when the West Germans had to make a choice between France and the possibility of British membership, they chose France. By 1970, Brandt is thinking about Ostpolitik and rapprochement towards the East. And in that context, to keep the Europeanness of his own vision, he wants Britain in. And by the same token, Pompidou is persuaded, and his ministers persuade him, that if Brandt is beginning to look to the east, then the French must indeed have allies in the west. And that means having Britain inside the community. So thinking strategically, as well as in terms of economics, Pompidou is minded to make that great triangle of West European powers, Great Britain, France, and West Germany, within the community, rather than being anchored on the outside, as de Gaulle had mentioned. It didn't mean that all was plain sailing ever since, and I won't spend much time on our period within the community, because I haven't got much time, but just to remind you that it's not just about the politics of the EEC, but very difficult economic international environment with war in the Middle East, oil crisis, with problems, and in the archives there were a lot of very interesting documentation on this, and the lack of enthusiasm remaining within Britain, which is expressed in the 1975 referendum, which was largely cooked up, to be honest, as Mr. Saunders, Professor Saunders in Queen Mary College has told us. And this moves on into the 80s, this ambivalence about the European communities. Now, in the last few minutes that I have, I cannot avoid Brexit. And I say this with tears in my eyes. It is the experience of the 2016 referendum which makes us revisit this period, and that's why this conference is so very topical. Because we must ask ourselves, was this indeed a 50-year game, an adventure, and one that was out of context for the trajectory of British foreign policy? Or was our leaving the European Union the result of different kinds of factors coming into play, including some rather dodgy politics within the United Kingdom itself? We will probably never know, as historians, whether it was indeed inevitable that Britain would leave the European Union. But let me remind you, my friends, that we do know Brexit has now scarred both Britain, and particularly Britain, but also the European Union. We seem openly, and perhaps uniquely, except perhaps for Russia, emburdened by our post-experience, our experience of post-imperial living. We have an obsession with the Anglosphere, the Commonwealth, Five Eyes, national sovereignty, our own legal and constitutional system, for a sort of go-it-alone autonomy, which is larded with some non-specific but extremely unpleasant hostility towards some immigrants, and a very bizarre attachment to sterling. These seem to be the cultural markers for British nostalgia. Yet those in favour of leaving have not constructed a new vision that stands up to any scrutiny. And if I might just say, I was bulldozed into going onto a platform with one Lord Frost, who will be familiar to some in the UK, but maybe not to others, in Wolfson College, where he was invited to speak about the delights of Brexit. And somebody, either the college or Lord Frost himself, got cold feet and said, let's bring Anne Dighton in to liven it up a bit. Frost said, we decided that we must leave the European Union because we were not competitive enough within the Union. That being inside the European Union reduced our competitiveness. I couldn't help but tell him that actually that was exactly the same argument that we used in 1960s and 1970 to join the community. Outside, we were not competitive. Lord Frost responded by saying, it's all to do with national sovereignty. it was the end of our dialogue on that subject. And try as I wanted to, I could not stir him out of his pudding of national sovereignty. I just reflect on that now. The government has not convinced us of sunny uplands. We're trapped in a terrible mess about Northern Ireland, which those who know about it are most anxious about. And the linking between the decisions over Ireland and our post-imperial heritage and Brexit and the future of the shape of the United Kingdom are far more closely and dangerously linked than public discourse has us believe. Does it all matter? Yes, it does. Quite apart from the loss of British national prestige, which is deeply embarrassing. And I apologise to our French colleagues for the bad diplomatic behaviour that you've had to encounter in the last few years. For crucial moments, historians can now see the past through a new lens, and unfortunately, Brexit is just such a lens. States can be positive builders of an international system. The UK was a positive builder of a global international system and a recalcitrant builder of a European system until the dilemma of supranationality came to absorb it. And it's ironic because we encouraged East European members to join the European Union, remember that, to shift their own cultures, whereas we appear to have been impossible to do it. So I'm afraid that we are left with soft power Europeanness, human rights, with a weakening attachment to human rights, language, I like the way we still speak language in Europe, in the EU, geography, our wealth, perhaps coming to terms with our shared and sometimes awkward imperial histories that our continental colleagues all have, or most of them have. And we must now tiptoe quietly while trying to build sectoral relationships, especially in the security dilemma, with us as Europeans with a small u, rather than Europeans with a capital U for the Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, and for that overview, particularly from my point of view, the comments on what Brexit has done and its origins. Agnès Tachin, lecturer in contemporary history at Cergy Paris Université and a member of the Héritage Culturel Patrimoine, and also the author of Annie et Rival, La Grande-Bretagne dans l'imaginaire français à l'époque gaulienne, which is something I haven't read, but just having read the title, I realise I must.
Thank you very much, Dominique. And I would like also to thank the Institut Georges Pompidou and La Maison Française d'Oxford for the invitation to this conference. In this paper, I will focus on two dates in the 60s, 1963 and 1967, when French President de Gaulle twice vetoed the British application for the common market. His decision triggered a crisis between France and its European partners and poisoned relations between Paris and London for nearly a decade. Over the past 40 years, French vetoes have given rise to numerous publications and different interpretations and have been studied more than the phase of enlargement that followed. The first work on the subject in the 1970s were based on secondary sources such as the memories and declarations of the main protagonists. Since the 1990s, access to primary sources have enabled historians to better understand the vetoes and the reactions they provoked in France, the UK, and within the community. Most of these works have analyzed Gaullist opposition to British membership within the broader context of European integration and the Cold War. For my part, I have favored a cultural approach to the subject. I took an interest in French reactions to the vetoes based on a broader study of representations and taking into account the profound changes that took place in France and England over the course of the decade. In this presentation, I will first look at the different approaches that have helped to better understand the de Gaulle's thinking. I will then focus on the position of the other politicians in the president's entourage, in particular that of Georges Pompidou as Prime Minister, and finally on the reaction of French public opinion to the vetoes. Since 1990s, the gradual opening up of governmental archives has enabled historians to multiply their approaches and show the full complexity of the veto issue. A first strand in this research, represented by historians such as Maurice Weiss, has demonstrated the geopolitical reasons and insisted on the security and defense issues. Another trend focused on economic issues. Pierce Ludlow and Laurent Varlouzet showed the importance of the common agricultural policy, which de Gaulle was determined to implement. The vetoes had as much to do with pragmatic and economic issues as with political visions. In addition to these factors, there were also historical and personal reasons. Historians such as Peter Mangold or more recently Julian Jackson have emphasized de Gaulle's complex relationship with the Anglo-Saxons since the Second World War. All these political, economic, and historical reasons are closely intertwined. When he returned to power, de Gaulle wanted to restore France's greatness. His attitude was both pragmatic and guided by his grand design. He understood that his country needed the common market economically, and that through Europe he could once again play a leading role on the world stage, provided that Europe was independent of the United States, particularly in terms of defense and security. Over the last 2 decades, historical studies of the crisis of the 1960s have also helped to sweep away a number of ideas conveyed by the classic narrative of European integration. They tended to deconstruct the image of de Gaulle fighting alone against everyone, an image largely maintained by de Gaulle himself, as well as by the media, and highlighted by cartoonists such as Moisan and Leffel from Le Canard Enchaîné in France, or Cummings in England. Several studies have qualified the supposed unanimity of the Five against France, the conditions set by the British government during the negotiations also worried the Italians and Germans. We need to distinguish between official positions and the reality of negotiations, where the French leaders were able to show themselves to be more pragmatic and less intransigent. The focus on French President de Gaulle and British Prime Ministers Macmillan and Wilson tends to reduce the history of European integration to a confrontation between great statesmen. The role of close collaborators, as well as public opinion, helped to understand vetoes. The reactions to the French president's decision show that there was a consensus on the question on the British candidacy, especially on the first veto. Also, some politicians in the president's entourage admitted that they were surprised by his decision. They agreed with him on the substance. Éric Roussel noted in his Pompidou biography that the Prime Minister remained in the background after the first veto, avoiding any untimely declarations out of the respect for le domaine réservé. According to several witnesses and historians, Pompidou was concerned only with domestic affairs. But from the time of his appointment as head of government in April 1962, he followed the discussion underway in Brussels and took part in talks with the British. As you can see in this picture, he came to Champs in June and to Rambouillet in December. He was with Couve de Merville. And Pompidou and Couve de Merville thought that the negotiation would break down on their own, given the many disagreements of agricultural issues and relation with the Commonwealth. In July 1962, at a restricted council meeting, Pompidou said of the negotiations in Brussels, and I quote, "It would be in our interest to let the matter get bogged down in the sounds." In 1965, the empty chair crisis and differences with Germany led French leaders to be more open to dialogue. In November, Pompidou told Edward Hills, who was visiting Paris at the time, that France was very much in favor of the economic community and would like to see Great Britain join for geographical and human reasons as a counterweight to German industry, and because a political Europe is unthinkable without it. At the Council of Ministers meeting in November, de Gaulle said also that things were evolving in a positive manner with Great Britain. But the following year, following the Luxembourg Compromise and France's withdrawal from NATO, his tone again became firmer on British membership. The record of decision of the Restricted Council 17 October 1966 states that France's position in this respect remains unchanged. With plan for a second application looming in the spring of 1967, the French tried to find a way to avoid repeating the bad impression created by the first veto. Olivier Wamser, who had been negotiator in Brussels for the first candidacy, suggested nipping the thing in the bud by opposing the very opening of negotiations, and also proposed preparing public opinion by informing it of the open hostility of the English towards the French. This second recommendation reflects a concern about the reaction of French public opinion which might disapprove of the second veto. Why? What did the French think of Britain's application to join the common market? Polls at the time showed that 49% of French people were in favor of British membership in September 1961, and just 9% against. But they show also that de Gaulle's press conference of January had had an effect of the French. In February, 44% approved the veto, and 21 disapprove it, 36 no opinion. Why did the French change their minds? The hostile attitude of British towards the common market, their intransigence on membership conditions during the negotiations, and the special relationship with the United States raised doubt about their sudden conversions to Europe. After the Nassau Conference, and just 3 weeks before the veto, the image of England as the Trojan horse of the United States began to circulate in the press. The study of representations may also explain the French turnaround. In his press conference, de Gaulle described England as a country apart, very different from continental countries in everywhere, insisted on the structural difference, but this was exactly how the French perceived England at the time. They were the dominant representation found in all sources. General de Gaulle had declared at his conference that England would have to change in order to join the EEC. Change didn't come in the following years, but no way he expected it. In fact, from 1963 on, under the influence of its youth, England changed its face. The Cultural Revolution of the 60s, with the arrival of the Beatles on the music scene, and followed by Swing in London, made the country attractive to young French people. While baby boomers see permissive society as a model to follow, adults condescendingly interpret these changes as a new symptom of British decline. Its low growth rates in comparison with those of France reinforced this impression among the ruling class. Different perception of England highlighted the tension between the generation in France that led to the May 68 crisis. In an earlier book, historian François Crouzet showed how England's supremacy had nurtured ambivalent feelings of fascination and jealousy in France for over 2 centuries. This inferiority complex disappeared when de Gaulle came to power. The success of the common market, France's rapid recovery on the international stage, and as a counterpoint, England's growing difficulties and hesitations about Europe gave rise to a new self-confidence in France that was brilliantly revealed by the first veto. Europe had contributed to reversing the Franco-British balance of power, placing the British in a position of demand towards France. The veto looked like revenge for the past 200 years. But the Cultural Revolution also had an effect on French public opinion. From 1964 on, English fashions flooded into France. Anglo-mania became a mass phenomenon and changed the way the French looked at the British. The 1966 publication of Asterix in Brittany is a good example of this. René Goscinny described in his book cultural differences with humor, the most comical effect coming from the literal translation of its English expressions. In April 1967, a poll revealed that 44% of French people felt their country had more in common with England than with Germany. Also, de Gaulle opposed the second British application more firmly, brandishing the threat of the dissolution of the common market. The French were less convinced that in 1963, with 41 approving the second veto, compared with 44 for the first one. And when the question asked relates to feelings rather than the objective reason, favorable opinions are more numerous. 40% saying that they were personally in favor of British membership. Non, c'est pas, non, c'est pas celle-là, sorry. C'était celle-là. Voilà. So, the veto had no lasting effect on the number of favorable opinions, which continues to rise over the long terms. The second veto created a more serious crisis than the first and confirmed that no progress could be made on enlargement while de Gaulle was in power. Several facts and testimonies confirm that Pompidou had decided to leave the veto even before his arrival at the presidency. To conclude, I think it's important to highlight the changes that took place over the decade and led Pompidou to leave the veto. The situation was very different in 1969. Almost a decade had passed since the first application, and in the meantime, the community had grown stronger, demonstrating its ability to negotiate during the Kennedy round, for example. The French and the British have also changed with the transformation of lifestyles and the rapid evolution of mentalities under the influence of new generations, helping to bring the two people closer together. The French view of their British neighbors has softened. The most negative stereotypes tended to disappear. Likewise, Fashoda and Marcel Kébir no longer have much significance for the new generations, and Pompidou became aware of this change. He had to manage the May 68 crisis and took his distance with de Gaulle just after. Although he may have doubted the sincerity of the British commitment to Europe at the beginning of the decade, he was more pragmatic than de Gaulle. He thought that the British membership would reinforce the community and act as a counterweight to German power. The veto was lifted for political and economic reasons, but it was also a way for Pompidou to mark the end of the Gaullist era, which a majority of French people wanted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Agnès. And our last speaker, Marie-Claude Esposito, Professor Emeritus at Sorbonne Nouvelle Paris 3, and a member of the research team Integration and Cooperation in the European Area, and publisher of numerous books on Franco-British relations.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to talk about a reform which was very important for Edward Heath, but which contributed to his fall, unfortunately, less than 1 year after he had been able to take Britain into the EEC, which was, for him a very important event. So this reform is called Competition and Credit Control. Then I will call it CCC because it's going to be quicker. And this reform is part of the reform which had been planned by Edward Heath when he was in opposition, and the whole reforms were called the Quiet Revolution. So the context is that the end of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rate parities that had been in place since World War II and which collapsed at the beginning of the 1970s. And this was due to President Nixon's decision to end the convertibility of the dollar to gold on the 15th of August 1971. And because of the dollar problems, the growing deficits of the UN's balance of payments, it meant that European central banks had been forced to sustain the dollar, that is to say, to buy the dollars of the US deficit, which had resulted in surging inflation in all Western countries. And the UK was the first country to be engulfed in a severe economic crisis and to experience what is called stagflation, that is to say, stagnation and inflation at the same time, or unemployment and inflation at the same time. In opposition, Heath and the Conservative Party had prepared, as I said, an economic strategy entitled A Quiet Revolution, which aimed at realizing radical changes in British economic life by relying on individual responsibility, freedom of business, more competition, and a reduction of state intervention. And of course, all these reforms were supposed to cure the diseases, the economic diseases Britain was suffering from, so that the country would be more able to get into the EEC. So Edward Heath's priority was to fight inflation without resorting to the traditional instrument of incomes policy. And 1971 was also the year that saw what was going to be called the Barber boom, after the name of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Anthony Barber, but in practice, owing much more to Heath. I mean, the boom. As Deputy Governor, Jasper Holm remarked in January 1971, and I quote, "Everything pointed to a repetition of the 1962-1964 situation in which Treasury and bank caution would be very uncongenial to ministers, and there would be a strong tendency for them to go for growth." In the same way, several years later, Governor O'Brien explained soon afterwards to the clearing bankers that the pressures towards reflation were increasing, and that these moves were not timely. But he recognized the influence that unemployment figures had on ministers. There followed in July a mini-budget full of reflationary measures. This budget had no economic justification, but was forced on for political reasons. Opinion polls were bad, and sometimes something had to be done, all the more as Britain was about to join the common market. Now, the reform was entirely the work of the Bank of England, and this is not surprising since it dealt with the areas of expertise of the bank, control on lending, its knowledge of the foreign exchange market, its knowledge of the gilt-edge market, which played a very important role for the management of the public debt. But what is surprising is that the Treasury was informed of the proposed changes at the very late stage. They were informed in January, the first meetings were held in February, and it is only on the 12th of March that Governor O'Brien sent a letter to the Chancellor that outlined the proposals. CCC was a 4-page consultative document published by the Bank of England of 15 May 1971, very liberal in its approach. The aims of the reform was threefold: to increase competition within the banking sector, to improve the bank regulatory system for demand management purposes, and finally to increase the ability of the monetary authorities, that is to say Bank of England and Treasury, to control the money stock. So a few words about the reform, but just a few words because it's rather technical. The measures were introduced to deal with the non-competitive aspects of the banking system, and they were a response to criticism from two quasi-official bodies, the National Board for Prices and the Monopolies Commission. The reform proposed to end the interest rate cartel and the lending ceilings, so that was concerning the clearing banks. It proposed to introduce a liquidity ratio of 12.5% on all private sector's banks and near banks, and it also introduced the discontinuation of the collective tender for treasury bills. The document received a warm welcome from the Times, from the Economist, from the Banker, and the Prime Minister explains the new committee to the 1922 committee in September. That is to say, only a few weeks after the Chancellor of the Exchequer had made the famous U-turn with a very reflationary package. And the least I can say is that it was a very unfortunate conjunction of events. The results of the reform from October 1971 to December 1973, so a positive one, which an intensification of competition within the banking sector, and of particular importance was the entry of the clearing banks in their own right and not through their subsidiaries into wholesale money markets, both as borrowers and lenders. And the difference between clearing banks and non-clearing banks became blurred. Another result, which was not positive, was the explosion of lending. And monetary growth was very strong in the first half of 1972. Then from 1971 to the end of 1973, bank advances in sterling to UK residents rose by no less than 148%. And most of that lending was directed to property and finance and not to industry. So that was a very, very bad result. But it was linked to Heath's government objective of economic growth at all costs. And for the Bank of England, it resulted in a loss of control of the money supply, which was going to be very important, and of course a very important problem too. Bank rate was raised from 5 to 6% in June 1972, and that was the time when the pound was made floating, and that was also a bad result. And you know, the British Britain has just joined the. Well, the decision was just taken so that he could join the common market. The Bank of England advocated another rise, but Heath was totally opposed to such a move. And then ministers went on refusing rises of the bank rate, and inflation at that time was running at an annual rate of 7.2%. Governor O'Brien was severely criticized for not having defended his view in relation to interest rate policy, but he was, I say, very powerless in the context of a weak chancellor and a very determined prime minister. And at the beginning of 1972, he had been told that the chancellor and the prime minister were on very divergent lines. In October 1972, bank rate was replaced after 270 years by a new mechanism called the minimum lending rate that was linked to the market rate for treasury bills, but this had not a positive effect to reduce the rate of monetary growth. The Prime Minister was also very angry at the attitude of the governor of the Bank of England, and he decided to have another governor at the head of the Bank of England. Alors, I would like to quote a long quotation by Governor O'Brien before he was sacked, because I think it's very interesting. I will tell you after I've read the situation. It was a speech he made to his colleagues. I quote, "I do not think it is too alarmist to say that the bank's whole authority in the city is in some jeopardy. We pride ourselves on the lack of banking law and specific regulations, and on the superior merits of the governor's eyebrows. This is only justified if the latter are used with firmness to give unmistakable messages which are accepted as just and fair by all concerned. The real trouble there is that the bank, despite its apparent conversion to modern scientific credit management, still loves its traditional ways too. It clings to the ancient rituals of nod, nod, wink, wink, but whereas in the good old days a nod was a nod and a wink, now a nod may turn out to be a wink a nod, good morning, and a wink no more than hello, darling. What is more, you can't learn this sign language. It is liable to change every week. The dilemma for the bank is between going completely modern, which it has not yet the will to do, and going back, which it can't do. It should face up to it soon." So I think this is extremely interesting, and it shows the difference, the big difference between the way the Bank of England used to operate monetary control at that from the ancient times up to that time, and the way monetary control was operated in France and in other European countries. So, as I said, he was sacked. He said that O'Brien had to go. So, in March 1973, the Prime Minister asked for a reprisal of CCC, and the main question was to find out whether competition and credit control were compatible and whether credit controls were not a better option. The main criticism was that there had been no control over the money supply or bank lending since CCC, and the rampant inflation since 1972 was a consequence of the new policy. The review considered that the reform made it impossible for the Bank of England to control the quantity of money or credit. So a new governor was appointed. He was called Gordon Richardson. He had been chairman of Schroders, that is to say, a famous merchant bank, and a non-executive director of the Bank of England since 1967. And in July 1973, he warned the chairman of the Association of British Banks that if the increase in lending and the corresponding increase in the money supply went on, restrictive measures would follow, and this might include direct controls. That is to say, he warned the bank that he was ready to return to the older way of controlling bank advances. In his letter to the bank, Richardson also addressed the issue of interest rate arbitrage activities, and especially an activity known as round-tripping. And this round-tripping was responsible of an important increase in both M3 and interest rates. In October 1973, as you know, there was the first round of OPEC oil prices increases, and there was also the beginning of the miners' strike, which resulted in the Prime Minister declaring a state of emergency in November and a 3-day working week at the beginning of 1974. And how much do I have? 5 minutes?
Yeah, all right, for another
okay.
3-4 minutes.
Okay. So on 15 November, the Chancellor wrote to the Governor about the impact of CCC and the effect of high interest rates. Barber recorded that despite the merits of CCC, it had unforeseen and undesirable consequences from the point of view of the government's overall economic strategy and its political and social priorities. And the Prime Minister wanted to find an alternative with less adverse consequences, both short-term and long-term. And Barber pressed the Bank of England to have new ideas, and I quote, which would rely less exclusively on increases in interest rates to control the level of money supply. End of quotation. A new technique was devised by the bank. initially described as a supplementary scheme that was added to the CCC arrangements. Banks were asked to deposit free interest-free with the Bank of England a percentage of their interest-bearing deposits. It became quickly known as the supplementary special deposits, and later as the corset which was going to be suppressed by Margaret Thatcher, but that's another story. And there was a renewed debate on the impact of credit ceiling that had been suppressed with CCC. There was little appetite for their reintroduction. Further tightening measures were announced by Barber on 17 December. And these measures marked a return to reliance on quantitative controls on the banking sector, a total U-turn for the proponents of CCC, because as you have understood, the reform was a failure. So to conclude, we can say that the reform can be seen as a parenthesis, and we can also say that the problem of monetary control was at the beginning of a new era, because nothing was solved at that time. And the problem was going to go on and to go on and to go on. And that's another story as well. The pound sterling was not in good conditions. It was, as I said, floating, which was not the best signal for the UK entering the common market, because at that time continental countries were attached to fixed parities. And as you know, the pound had been a very important part of the discussion Edward Heath and President Pompidou had in Paris, and the famous summit. So it's really a pity to see that Edward Heath, which was, I think, the best European the British had, was in fact because he was because of one of his reform, you know, his country, which was at last in the European community, had a severe drawback just after entering the European community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke, for that. And I think it does raise some very interesting questions about whether that had a long-term impact on UK perceptions of EEC membership as a sort of bad start. Because certainly, and I remember it very well, it was a very difficult time, although it didn't, on the face of it, have an impact on the referendum in 1975. But then, as the point was made earlier, that referendum was in some ways a rather artificial event. We now have some time. I'm not quite sure exactly how long, because in theory we have about 10 minutes, but I think that possibly the pause is going to be delayed by about 5 or 10 minutes, because we did start late. Actually, on that basis, we are on time, which is a miracle, and to have a discussion. And I wondered, please feel free in the audience. Is there a roving mic, or is it people just stand? I suspect we can hear. If people would like to speak, and some of the replies will be in French, and indeed we can do it in French if you'd like as well. So, c'est comme vous voulez. On peut le faire en anglais ou en français. Je sais qu'Agnès va répondre en français, mais c'est à vous. J'encourage votre participation. Voilà. Qui veut commencer?
Ne soyez pas timide.
So I have a question in English.
Yes.
Please. We have a very iconic image of the late Queen, and I'm wondering whether or not historians currently have a very clear view on her opinion of exiting and also joining the EU, and also of her influence with British politicians and the French politicians.
Who on the panel would like to?
Well,
But Anne?
il faut. Well, of course, as you know very well, the monarch's position is outside, if not above, politics. I think that what I could say immediately is that after the first veto in '63, the royal visit to France was postponed, if not ended totally. So there was a reaction within the British community at all levels. I have a hunch that you're actually thinking about the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign as much as you're thinking about earlier on in her reign. I think everyone, even if they're the monarch, is entitled to feel a bit cheesed off with what is going on around them, which is my remarks about Brexit. And I'm very much taken by that one iconic image of the Queen, I think opening a session of the House of Commons, am I right? Wearing blue and yellow. Yeah. Which, you know, this is before the Ukrainian war, so it wasn't symbolizing that at that stage. I think I was very interested by the fact that the organizers put this image of the Queen on the front of the brochure. And my take from that was rather different from what perhaps yours was. Mine was, what was the impact of the monarchy and the varying moments of pleasure in the monarchy and anger with the monarchy when they have their annus horribilis or whatever upon our continental partners. Because Paris Match and the French
We love the Queen.
love the Queen. Well, you know, I mean, at least you didn't take her away with you. So I think that you're right to pick it up as a symbol, and the symbol why it was used today, because I think it's ambivalent in the United Kingdom and rather more two-dimensional when you look at the role of the monarchy on our continental partners. That's the best I can do off the cuff, I'm afraid.
Anyone else?
Je me souviens d'avoir vu un chapeau de la reine, à peu près à la même période où elle avait
Oui.
ce vêtement en jaune et bleu. Elle avait un chapeau, il y avait les étoiles comme sur le flag, le European flag. Alors, à moins que ce soit un fake.
It was signing, yes.
Oui.
I think the Queen was very comfortable with EU participation. It's true that the royal family and the monarchy always identify very close to the Commonwealth, because the Queen was head of the Commonwealth and saw that as very important. But I didn't detect in all the time that I certainly towards the end of the years I was in government, that there was any sense that the sovereign was not committed to making European Union membership work, because ultimately the sovereign is a facilitator. The government sets the policy, the sovereign has to go along with it. But there was nothing to suggest that the advantages of that were not understood. And she was a very shrewd lady. I mean, after all, the very last political comment she ever made, we now know, was to tell Liz Truss that she should pace herself, which in the circumstances was was a singularly apt comment. We don't know what the conversation was which took place before, but, you know, dealing with this question of financial policy running away, we'd had nothing since the Barber since Barber destroyed the credibility of the UK economy, which is what he did, until Truss did it again.
Une double question pour Marie-Claude. La première rapide. Est-ce que cette réforme du CCC avait déjà été imaginée en fin janvier 1970, quand il y a eu cette petite réunion à l'hôtel de Selden? Donc ça aurait fait partie du Selden Programme plutôt que de l'idée de mettre en place a Quiet Revolution. Et ensuite, d'après ce que vous avez dit, les résultats n'étaient pas fameux. Hein. D'ailleurs, vous avez bien précisé que le Chancellor s'est fait éjecter.
Non, c'est le gouverneur de la Banque d'Angleterre.
Quel message à ce moment-là envoyer aux Français pour quand même les rassurer, puisque la livre allait être affaiblie, sachant que n'était pas De Gaulle, mais que De Gaulle avait quand même posé son deuxième veto, sachant qu'en 67, la livre a été dévaluée en Angleterre, donc était déjà passée par cette phase de faiblesse. Donc est-ce qu'il y a eu entre Pompidou et Heath une correspondance où quand même Heath essayait de rassurer son homologue français, même si on savait que ça y est, la Grande-Bretagne allait rentrer, pour dire vous n'allez pas faire rentrer un pays faible dans l'Union?
Alors, pour la première question, cette réforme a été... on a commencé à en parler avant la Quiet Revolution. Maintenant, pour répondre à votre deuxième question, là, il faudrait vraiment aller voir les archives de Edward Heath. Et pour l'instant, je n'ai pas encore regardé celle de la Banque d'Angleterre sur cette réforme. Donc, je ne peux pas répondre très précisément à votre question. Quand j'aurai vu les archives, je vous dirai.
The box.
Thank you. I also have a question for Professor Esposito, but in English.
Yes.
You've presented the CCC and Ted Heath's new term on economic policy as opposites, essentially. But I was wondering whether this easy money policy that was carried out within the framework of the CCC was in any way linked with the industrial strategy that Heath launched between 1972 and 1973, in particular connection with the Industry Act, which was all about regional planning and regional development. Can you comment?
Yes, I can comment on that. I mean, the problem is that there were technical results which I haven't mentioned because I didn't have time to do that, but I can. But that's rather technical. For instance, the Bank of England didn't anticipate something which is called re-intermediation. That is to say, some financial business which comes back, which was not included in the calculation of a monetary aggregate, but because of the reform, they come back into the aggregate, and this was not anticipated. The same problem happened exactly when Margaret Thatcher, she was elected in 1979. Donc in 1980, she suppressed the exchange controls and took other, and she suppressed the corset, and exactly the same phenomenon took place, and the monetary supply surged. So this is what happened. One of the main results of the reform, and this is why it was not the proper time, and because the monetary there was this very big increase in the monetary supply. It would have been necessary to use interest rates, to increase interest rates a lot, but Heath didn't want that for political reasons. And this is why there was a big problem. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, if you want to come back briefly, and we'll move on.
Very briefly. Yes, but what do you think is the link between, if there was any, between this policy, this monetary policy, and the industrial policy that was promoted by the Industry Act of 1972? Is there any connection between the two? They belong to two completely different economic policy paradigms.
Not exactly, because one was to introduce competition, and the Industrial Act was a government intervention. So, on first thought, I would say that they are opposed, at least in their conception.
Yes. Yes. Well, the box can be handed. It's a.
Thank you very much for the box. I intervened rather hesitantly as a non-academic in this, but as a very junior diplomat, I was in Brussels for the first negotiations, the EEC negotiations, and I guess I may be one of the few people still alive who was in the room through most of it, actually. And I well remember the final meeting when Couve said that yes, indeed, de Gaulle meant exactly what he said, and the negotiations were finished. And I think it was the same evening that Heath convened the British delegation in their offices and analysed how the negotiations had gone. And he ended up by saying that he had really been looking to membership of the EEC to reinvigorate the British economy. And now, of course, that's not possible. It would be necessary for Britain to look at other ways to do that. And he also said that he thought that Britain could not look to join the EEC until de Gaulle was dead. One or two other things people have said have struck interesting chords as far as I'm concerned. And I must admit that memories are pretty faulty, and I find what I remember more usually sort of attitudes of mind rather than exactly what happened. But I do remember joining the Foreign Office in 1957, being really quite surprised how quickly official opinion seemed to move from being all about how we counter the EU, and there was EFTA and all the various ploys to sort of, I'm sorry, I tend to say EU and I mean EEC, but various ploys to sort of divert attention. But how quickly, when Macmillan sort of changed tack, the Foreign Office became really very excited about membership. However, I think it's also true that throughout all this, there was a sort of view that the French were the enemy. It was partly rather personal, I think, because the people who had been involved in the 61-63 negotiations were the people in the Foreign Office who actually knew about Europe. I mean, there were not many European specialists in the Foreign Office back then. So they were the people who continued to be involved in this. And I do think through quite a lot of my career, there was this little streak of almost enjoying scoring points off the French. I think the only other point I'd like to make is that, as Heath had said, and it continued, there were really great hopes that joining the EEC would solve so many of our economic problems. The argument seemed to be that when the community had originally been set up, it was a sort of halo effect, and that all countries went through a period of wonderful prosperity, and we hoped we'd have that too. And I think that the rather unhappy story that we've heard now reminded one of the terrible economic headwinds that there were when we actually did join. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That in a sense answered the question I was asking at the very beginning about the link between this economic horrible period, and I remember it. As I was just saying, at school, and then having candles to light your room at night. It's hard to imagine what it was actually like for anybody who didn't experience it. And all this coincided with within a few months of our having joined the EEC. So I think there was a subliminal link. Yes, who else wants to? A number of questions. And try and... So, okay. Yeah, and then we'll go there, and then we'll come back here.
Thank you. My question is really a follow-up from the previous one. And you talked of the antagonism that is so frequently found in British official attitudes towards the French. And yes, you spoke more of the more positive image of the British in France during the 60s and the cultural changes taking place then. Obviously, the diplomats that we heard this morning, John the diplomat, is to soothe. I was very interested to hear what you said there. But on a political level, do you not think that there are very frequent occasions where politicians on both sides are deliberately promoting an antagonism to score political points? It's a very easy card to play on both sides. Perhaps not with Heath and Pompidou, one of the rare partnerships which seem to get on, but all the others. It's deliberate, it's provocative.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I completely agree with you. And one of the many things that I didn't mention is that it's been a phenomenon of British politics. There has been no party, apart from the Liberals early on, who has had a commitment to European integration that has stretched over their time in office and out of office. So this is true for the Conservatives, and then it's also true for Labour. So you have the European community as something of a political game. And it's very easy for opposition parties to criticise the party in power, but then when they come into power, and I think Wilson is a very good example of that, you suddenly realise that the cards are stacked against you if you aren't in favour of joining, for all the reasons that Juliet Campbell has just mentioned, that you've got to get in there to solve your own problems as well as contributing. And that makes it very difficult compared to our continental partners, that there was not a party, and there still isn't a party, to be honest, that says, look, this is a good thing. It has ups and downs, it has its good moments and its bad moments, etc., and all those arguments, but we're there for it. And that just didn't happen in the UK, which is why I think Frost is so wrong in his arguments about solving our economic problems being inside or outside, because essentially what we're moving towards is an understanding, and I was fascinated by your paper as well on the French, that our problem is a British problem to do with our own political culture. And I come back to the point I made, that after the end of the Cold War, we thought that the Poles and the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Slovaks would be able to have a sort of volte-face and drop their cultural inheritance of the past 40, 50 years and even longer, and become biddable members of the European Union, when we, the Brits, we couldn't do it. And I think that's why I find the cultural turn, that you are obviously a leading representative of, is so very interesting. And what is it that's wrong within our system that makes us, A, want to do quick fixes, whether it's finance and banking or investment, but an inability to speak to our own voters, our own people, and that awful 2019 election is a brilliant example of it, as adults, if you like, saying that there is no golden wonderland, either outside or inside. And I think it's shown a sort of adolescence in the British culture. And I was really struck by your paper, how this has played out. And your book is very interesting on the competitive relationship between the French and the British. Sorry, that's a long answer.
Anybody else on the panel? Agnes? No. I mean, I was just going to add, as the chair, that this persistence of seeing France as this sort of historic rivalry and translating, I think, often into shallow stereotyping, is a very prominent phenomenon in British politics. I mean, I've sat round cabinet tables as Attorney General. I won't give away all the state secrets, but listening to people's comments about France and the French, which are entirely stereotypical. And in a sense, you know, when Boris Johnson, donnez-moi un break, it absolutely highlights and an inability to see how poorly it often goes down with the opposite party. And it's deeply embedded. And yes, it has got a schoolboy. It's got a sort of playground quality about it. Now, I don't know France well enough to know that whether the French have the same attitude towards the British. It's true that they also have stereotypes about us, which can be very seriously mistaken. But they're slightly different in their nature. But undoubtedly, the riling of the French is a British phenomenon, deeply embedded in our national psyche, and not very good. Yes.
Could I take the liberty of making a comment rather than a question that just relates back to this specific point? So I'm speaking later today, Dan. I've done some work on the Foreign Office in France in the 1960s, and you can see the sort of hostility towards de Gaulle specifically increasing during the 60s with the first veto, with withdrawal from NATO, second veto, and then it comes to a sort of head in the end of the 1960s in the Soames affair, which people may remember when de Gaulle offers the British ambassador to France the opportunity to talk about the potential enlargement of the community, but they needed to have sort of secret bilateral conversations about it. And it's actually the Foreign Office which advises Wilson to take a very hard line against this, because they think this is a trap that de Gaulle is setting for the British. And Wilson is actually disposed to enter into a sort of genuine conversation about this and sort of initiate studies within Whitehall to look at what this might mean. But he's advised very strongly by the Foreign Office to take a hard line on this, to work to maintain Britain's cooperation with the Five against the French. And then there's a review after the Soames affair, because Wilson thinks they've made a bad mistake afterwards, in the Foreign Office about whether they've become anti-French, and actually they reached the conclusion that they're not, but there might be elements of anti-de Gaulle sentiment within the Foreign Office, which is a product of what has been happening in the 1960s.
And also a sense that Soames might be inclined to go off-piste. I mean, if we're talking about individuals, that was there as well.
And right. And then there was somebody at the back, further back, needs the box.
I have a question for Professor Dayton. I'd like to ask about the potential challenges posed by Brexit on the historiography of Britain's membership of the European Community moving forward. The history of Britain and Europe in the 1990s and 2000s is largely yet to be written. And I'm curious how you think historians are going to approach not only this period, but also in revisiting the decades that have already been well covered. Is there not a danger that the historiography on Britain's membership is going to bifurcate into pre- and post-Brexit literatures? How do you think European historians should approach the challenge of trying to identify the origins of Brexit in the long durée, while also documenting and assessing Britain's constructive contribution to the integration process?
It's a very big question, and it's a very interesting question. Let me make one or two observations. There has some of the early accounts of why we got to Brexit and went through Brexit tended to start in the 1990s. And I remember peer reviewing at least one book on Brexit, which started with Maastricht and Major. And in fact, in my peer review, before it came out, I said, you've got it wrong. And to his credit, the author stuck in a chapter before, saying it was quite complicated even before Maastricht. I'm not going to tell you which the book was, but that was one view. You know, what's gone wrong? Is it something to do with the Tory party and its behaviour over Maastricht and the debates there and Major's efforts to keep the show on the road, or was this a longer problem? So that's one little point that I want to make. The other point was that if you look back, there's a sort of symmetry between how we went in, which Piers Ludlow is a specialist on, so I speak with a lot of caution, and how we left. That is to say, we were the first country with which the community had to negotiate, so they had to make up the rules as they went along. Likewise, when we left, we were the first country to put in an application to go, so Barnier and his team and the members of the European Union likewise had to make up the rules of the game as we were leaving. And that is a sort of bizarre kind of symmetry which makes it seem quite simple that it's part of the same process. I'm not sure it actually was, but it's a very interesting phenomenon, even to the example of having special conditions going in for agriculture and the Commonwealth, and Johnson's cherry picking going out. And diplomats at the time in Britain thought, you know, if we don't do it that way, we're going to be in all sorts of trouble. And they were in all sorts of trouble, because Barnier outmaneuvered the Brits, you know, head and shoulders. Didn't make Dominic.
Yes.
So that's one point. The other point is that the longue durée, that the Brits never really sort of got it where the continent was. And going in was not widely acclaimed, big fanfare, referendum slightly cooked up in 75, and going out again, heave a sigh of relief. We don't have to teach French and German and Spanish in schools anymore because we can all speak English. And, you know, look at Australia and Canada and America, and that's the way the world's going. You know, the Chinese tend to learn English before they learn German, for example. And so there's a sort of cultural complacency, which I think you were getting at as well. So I think there are a lot of today problems that mask how we look at the past, because you can put a good case that the reasons for going in were different, a different time frame, a different set of external circumstances, Cold War, the protection of the West against the possibility of the Soviets creeping over the East European borders and all that, and leaving, end of Cold War, it's all different, we're going to be in a multipolar world, we've got to be, you know, Singapore on Thames or whatever they called it, some ridiculous phrase like that. And so I think the historians got quite a chance. And I hope that young Professor Ludlow will write the definitive book on what actually happened and how we got in and out, and whether it is part of one process or in fact part of a more scattered world and a scattered international relations. But I think for historians, it's the big question. And that's why the archives are important, because although we look at archives through our lens of the 2020s, they are written through the lens of the 50s and 60s, and therefore we would need both historical imagination, but also historical judgment. Are we going to be narrators of the past, or are we going to be hanging judges of the past to make our decisions? So it's perhaps the key question that one may take on this issue of membership. But thank you for that question.
Anyone else want to come in on that? Agnes or Marie-Claude? Right. And I'm not sure how we're doing. It's nearly 11:05, and we were supposed to stop